Hello. We're almost done with A to Z's of horror. Our last entry will be on New Year's Day. So, yay, New Year's Day treat. So, today is Y for year 0. We love to scare ourselves by talking about the apocalypse or the advent of the millennium or the global rapture. Ready or not, the sky might be falling in, but the best thing about the year 2000 is the way it presses panic buttons in our imagination. Britain's new wave of horror comics provokes and shocks. The works of both Savoy Books and Alan Moore have been branded obscene and seized by police, but their comic book heroes attract as strongly as they repel. Almost all subjects could perhaps be expressed more coherently in the comic book form, says writer Alan Moore. I believe history is one subject that responds particularly well to a comic book treatment. Best known for his graphic novels Swamp Thing, Marvelman, aka Miracle Man, V for Vendetta, and Watchmen, the multiple award-winning Moore is perhaps Britain's most iconoclastic comics writer. Sorry, I'm happy because I'm surprised that he has an entry. I had never gotten this far in the book. Beginning in 1988, he teamed up with artist Eddie Campbell to create a 16-part melodrama entitled From Hell, a meticulous dissection of Jack the Ripper murders and the theories and conspiracies that still surround the case. The series is described by Moore as a post-mortem of a historical occurrence, using fiction as a scalpel. It was finally published as part work between 1991 and 1995. It's my belief that if you cut into a thing deeply enough, says Moore, if your incisions are precise and persistent and conducted methodically, then you may reveal not only the thing's inner workings, but also the meaning behind those workings. The conviction was shared by the historical personage whose life is central to From Hell, although perhaps his beliefs were expressed somewhat more broadly than mine. For my part, I am concerned with cutting into and examining the still warm corpse of history itself. In some of my chillest moments, I suspect that this was his foremost preoccupation also, albeit in pursuit of different ends. And then I've got some asides. Gods and beasts, that is what our world is made of. Adolf Hitler. I think the two major narrative impulses which brought me to the way I write comics and movies, no doubt about that, says Clive Barker. Alan Moore is the watcher on the wall of civilization. Kathy Aker. If From Hell is a narrative journey into the dark heart of Victorian England, then David Britten's Lord Horror is a revisionist account of the rise of Nazism as seen through the eyes of a madman. The character first appeared in 1989 as a satirical novel written by Britten, co-founder of Savoy Books, and was later adapted into graphic format in Savoy's Lord Horror and hardcore horror comics. And we've got a picture of David Britten and opposite Lord Horror. I don't think anyone would disagree that the 20th century has in many ways been the worst that humanity has seen so far, says Lord Horror artist John Coulthart. And it is our belief that demands a new form of horror. On the one hand, you've got the glamour of violence and the glamour of the characters themselves, but on the other hand, you've got them being involved in events that are totally beyond the pale. As far as fascism and the racism goes, they're really unacceptable. Lord Horror is based on William Joyce, the Nazi propagandist of the Second World War. He did broadcast to England for the Nazis under the nickname Lord Ha-Ha. Savoy Books editor and co-founder Mike Butterworth describes the character as a right-wing radical, and not many people have chosen right-wing radicals as sympathetic heroes in comics. The asides. David Britten's hardcore horror is an extraordinary work that simultaneously indicts and explodes the presumed conventions of the comic medium. Speakeasy, issue 116, December 1990, January 1991. Soon after the appearance of Lord Horror, a Manchester magistrate ruled the book obscene. Since then, both Britten and Savoy Books have been involved in police raids, court cases, and the threat of destruction for a number of their publications, including a comic based on Lord Horror. In 1992, a court ruling calling for the destruction of impounded copies of the novel was overturned after Savoy and International Free Speech Group Article 19 filed a successful appeal. Locus, issue 388, May 1993. And then we've got cover illustration for Hardcore Horror, number 5. The reader has to step back, continues Coulthart, especially if it is the central character, and examine what it is they're actually being shown and what they might be identifying with. And if they identify with it, what does that say about them? I always see Lord Horror as being a very Byronic character, says Savoy artist Chris Guidio. The man is a metropolitan Hamlet. He was a fashion violator, to be honest, so I like to think that I gave him this look. The man, a hairdresser's nightmare. You couldn't look like that and not be romantic to some extent. According to Coulthart, Lord Horror has a direct lineage to some other historical villains. His character builds on some of the horror characters of the 19th century, he explains. You've got Sweeney Todd Madness and Razor Blades, you've got Jack the Ripper, you've got Count Dracula stalking through the streets, and that leads to Nosferatu, which is a kind of visual influence in some of Horror's character. I think what we've added is an extra edge of darkness, which suits the extra edge of darkness that's in our century, but wasn't in the previous one. The numerous characters who populate the story all existed once, says Alan Moore of his series, From Hell. The motivations I have attributed to them and the words I have placed in their mouths are based, whatever possible, upon exacting historical research. Beyond that point, I have relied upon guesswork and conjecture, which, while I cannot hope to be accurate, is at least, I hope, informed. In the course of From Hell, we linked up with a number of historical sites around London into a fascinating magical pattern. But of course, if you take a large enough magic marker and small enough map, it's possible to make any pattern that you care to make. One of the initial impetuses from behind From Hell was probably born in the statement made by Margaret Thatcher when she suggested that we should return to Victorian values. With From Hell, I thought it would be a good idea, perhaps instructive, if we were to find out that those Victorian values actually were. Jack the Ripper is, even among serial killers, a special figure. He was never caught. He escaped not only into history, but into legend. What I wanted to do was to come up with a story that didn't solve the murders so much as try to solve the entire society surrounding the murder. There is no cheap melodrama. There are no shots of people running amok with bloody knives and snarling. It's all very quiet. If we show people going into a sweet shop, that's believable. If we show them walking down the street, that's believable. If we show them cutting a prostitute's kidney out and hanging her entrails over her shoulder, that's believable. Now, continues Moore, if you had lived in the Whitechapel region during this period, in some way that would have had an effect upon the way your life worked. We are not just talking about architecture here. We are talking about something that I suppose you could call psychotecture. The fact that buildings have a massive effect upon our minds. In fact, Hawksmoor churches were designed to have a massive effect upon our mind. All of the forces that shape our lives now seem to have had their beginning then, whether you're talking about art or science or politics. For example, the machine gun was invented in the 1880s, the motor car. In my researches, I found out that more or less the same time that Ripper murders happened here, Adolf Hitler was being conceived in Austria. Our aside is, Alan Moore's language and imagery are simultaneously comic and horrifying, as is the way with horror fiction, Ramsey Campbell. In all our efforts to describe the past, to list the simple facts of history, we are involved in fiction, even assuming all the data that we struggle to include within our various historical mosaics happens to be true. The moment we attempt to order it or to extract a meaning, we are trafficking in fictions, Alan Moore. A fine, sooty, fog-shrouded vision of Bloody Jackie's innovative Victorian slaughters. Graham Wilson on From Hell. And then opposite picture is Lord Horror. In Lord Horror, David Britton uses his character as a metaphor for the events that occurred during the period 1933 to 45, from Hitler's investiture as Reichskanzler to the appalling horror of the Holocaust. But not everybody was happy with Britton's unflinching depiction of the Nazi atrocities. In 1991, 2 years after the original novel was seized in a police raid at the Savoy offices, a Manchester magistrate's court judged the book obscene because of the title character's malignant anti-Semitism. Although author Michael Moorcock called the novel one of the most authoritative indictments of the Holocaust and our moral responsibility to it, Manchester police subsequently seized copies of Lord Horror and Hardcore Horror as well. And on 19 July 1995, Magistrate Janet Howard ruled the comics obscene and without any literary or artistic merit that might justify a public good defense. However, Savoy maintains that the comics have been targeted because of their less than flattering portrait of Manchester's ex-chief police constable, James Anderton, who initiated the original raid in 1991. What I was trying to portray with the Holocaust illustrations was a kind of lateral view of the real events, explains artist John Coulthart, and that it is what I call a metaphysical portrait of the death camps, not a realistic one. In a sense, we had to try to invent our own vocabulary. There is no story. It is just a succession of images. It's just still shots of the buildings, pipes, brickwork, schools, things like that. And so you're left with the pictures, which are worth 1,000 words as far as I'm concerned. And our asides are, there is no hanging at the end of From Hell. The verdict remained open. The history book silence. The noose empty. Alan Moore. Picture. There's nothing I can say about the absurdities of censorship that hasn't been said better by other people. It's self-evident in a way. You're not dealing with rational thought processes. Clive Barker. Fortunately, From Hell is also a horror story. It is a horror story about the fateful patterns that exist in time, in human enterprise, even in the stones in the cities wherein we conduct our lives. It's a horror story buried at the roots of the 20th century, and it just might conceivably be true. Alan Moore. I cannot reveal anything except this, of course. We knew who the Ripper was, one of the highest in the land. Inspector Aberlane, quoted by Nigel Morland, editor in The Criminologist, 1979. A picture of Alan Moore, very young Alan Moore, and some snippets from Hell. It's deliberately provocative in certain ways, admits Chris Gidio. There are sequences and where I've submitted drawings to David Britton, and he's actually said to me, oh, there can be much more blood on this page or whatever. And there's always this desire to go one stage beyond what the last person did. And of course it has worth, you know, that approach has worth. We're now in a position where there's nothing like it. For better, for worse, good and bad, people use Savoy comics as a yardstick. Alan Moore has also not shied away from showing graphic violence in his work. For me, the key scene in the entire From Hell is the murder and butchery of Marie Kelly, where he spent 2 hours in a room cutting her up. He had time to be, shall we say, creative. You have 30 pages of a man in a room with a dead body. There are snatches of dialogue when he imagines that he is talking to someone who isn't in fact there. But there are also long, excruciating silent sequences, which feel very nerve-shredding. These long silences where you just wish he'd say something or do anything other than keep cutting pieces off this woman. It becomes appalling. Hopefully the reaction of the audience is a long way removed from the general arousal that these scenes usually seem to elicit. I want them to actually be with him in that room, with me and with him. What From Hell can teach us about our own lives is that the same ancient destructive forces, that same misogyny, that same darkness is still with us. For all our veneer of technology, we've not managed to banish those shadows even slightly. Both From Hell and Lord Horror are damning reflections of horrific historical events. As long as writers like Alan Moore and David Britton have the courage to continue to detail the atrocities that mankind is capable of, then comic books and graphic novels will continue to remain a viable form of creative expression well into the new millennium. As the century draws to its end, Moore says, we find that our entire culture seems to be boiling and bubbling and erupting into strange new forms. I think that it is the job of artists to help us to understand the new shapes that our world is blossoming into. And then our final aside. One of the things that Alan Moore and I have in common is a kind of social contexting. The distress we feel about the status quo, about the current English cultural condition, finds its way into fiction. Clive Barker. And we have a picture of From Hell, which is a fantastic novel if you haven't read it. It's crazy. I like the bits in From Hell where they're traveling around the city and he's talking about, like they mentioned it earlier in the book just now, about if you have a magic marker, you know, you can make it look like these things all work together when they actually don't. And that it's pretty cool. But of course, I love Alan Moore's writing. The Watchmen is one of my favorite novels, and I used to read it every year when I did read it for the first time in high school. Ooh, so that was Y for year 0. Next week is Z for zombie, and we will be done with our A to Z's of horror. Thank you for reading with me. I'll see you next week.